Okay, I think I'm here, and hopefully we're all okay. And do you know something? This is we have a small group this morning, and I'm always delighted to be talking to a small group. So please, it's very informal. If you have anything that you'd even like a burning question just comes to you in the middle of it, just shout out, and I'm always happy to clarify something or come back and don't not to worry too much about the formalities of things. So, Alison, firstly, I'm so happy to have this invitation. Thank you very much. And I have to say, just from a friend's perspective, I'm not a Quaker myself, but I really do admire and I like very much just the idea of where the friends have come from and your approach to things. We actually always start our own newsletters to dear friends, and it's an important thing to me that we start like that because sometimes the world that we operate in is quite hostile to what we're saying, and we're often up against and in quite combative mode, when we're having to put forward some ideas because there are an awful lot of very powerful forces against some of the things that we would say. So it's actually a great relief to talk to friends, and to be with friends in this way. So thank you, and I'm very very happy just to be sharing a bit of the work that we do here at Alcohol Action. So, as Alison said, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what the picture is for alcohol in Ireland and some of our campaign work that we do to try and address some of the issues. So, AAI itself, we are a policy and advocacy group. So we don't provide services ourselves, but we research the policy environment and we look to see what has worked in other countries, other jurisdictions, and try to adapt that for an Irish situation, and then bring those policy solutions to policymakers, to the general public, and I suppose just to the wider society, because we also work at an international level as well. We're going just over 20 years now, 22 years. I've only been with the organization for the last 6 years. And I will say, like, so much of the work that I do is based on very long-standing work from others who have been associated with the group over those more than 20 years. We describe ourselves as independent, and what we mean by that is that we are independent of the alcohol industry. And that's important to note because there are charities who work in the space who are funded by the alcohol industry. And I do understand sometimes why that happens. Oftentimes people are desperate for funds and, and they will accept, money from the alcohol industry. But we don't ourselves, and most of our funding comes through the Health Service Executive, which is a bit like the NHS, and some private donations and grants that we would raise from perhaps on research projects that we're involved in. Okay, so probably when you mention Ireland, very often there is a kind of an acknowledgement. Oh yes, so the Irish drink a lot, and there's probably a bit of a problem there. Technically, the way in which drink a lot is described is by looking at how much do we drink per capita, and it's a useful kind of a measure because you can then use that to compare yourselves against other countries as well, and gives you a bit of a sense of what it is. So we drink at a rate of just under 10 litres per capita, 9.9, and we also have what's called high levels of binge drinking. We're the 8th highest across the OECD. So just to get that kind of comparison between, well, what does that look like in terms of other countries? So Europe is the highest drinking region in the world. And within Europe, we are well above the average. You possibly just can't see this terribly well, but we're up there at around, I think about the 8th or so from the top. So we have high levels. And the UK, I will say, is pretty high, also well above the average. And remember, that average is a very, very high average. So sometimes when you're talking about something like, litres per capita, litres of pure alcohol per capita, it's not always clear, well, what exactly do you mean by that, or what does that really look like? So if we were to kind of get a sense of, per drinker, how much actually gets drunk across a year. And an average drinker in Ireland is drinking, 284 cans of beer, plus 12 bottles of spirits, plus 43 bottles of wine, plus 35 cans of cider. And of course, that's only an average. So some people are actually drinking an awful lot more than that. And obviously some people are drinking a lot less. But that maybe just kind of gives you a little bit of perspective of what does this actually look like, and what we're talking about here. So as I mentioned as well, that not only do we drink a lot, but we drink a lot in spurts, so what are called binges. So a binge is described as technically as a heavy episodic drinking, and it means drinking more than 6 or more standard drinks in a typical drinking session. So a standard drink is a half pint of beer, a pub measure of spirits, or a small glass of wine. So just to give a little bit of context of what we mean there. That actually means that technically 3 pints of beer is now a binge, and a lot of times, oftentimes when I give this sort of talk, people kind of look at me and go, 3 pints? So we're just getting going, at that point. But that technical definition arises because it's what the body is. If you go beyond that, the body really has trouble in processing that amount at a time, and that's really where it comes from. So it's just to give a little bit of context for where that comes out of. So when we're drinking that amount of alcohol and we're drinking it in that kind of pattern, not surprisingly, we do actually see lots of problems arising from that. I've started here, and honestly, there's so many different statistics that you could actually pick out and pull together. But basically, 15% of the population would have an alcohol use disorder. 4 people die every day from alcohol. So right today, 4 people will die, which is I do find always very upsetting actually when I think about that. And another 4 will die tomorrow, and 4 the day after. If we were thinking of it in cost terms, it swallows up about 11% of our healthcare budget. And then in wider kind of terms, if we were looking at things like loss of productivity in the workplace, or we were talking about crime, that comes to about 2.5% of GDP, and that's about 12%, or sorry, 12 billion annually to Ireland. Actually, even that is an underestimate because it's not fully taken into account harm to others. And there is research in Australia which would say that the the cost to harm to others who have been harmed by alcohol is roughly equivalent to the cost to the individual who has been harmed by alcohol. So we would suspect that it's probably at least twice that amount that's there. Some of the other things that we have in terms of those harms to others, in Ireland, we have the 3rd highest level of FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We have a large section of our population who are either currently living with a parent who has a problem with alcohol, or they're living with the legacy of that. Actually, 1/3 of all children in Ireland live with a parent who's either a regular binge drinker or who is dependent on alcohol. And other sorts of things, in terms of the workplace, 1 in 7 workers report that they're impacted by another's drinking. And as I say, all of that adds up to massive impacts on justice and social care, and generally just a bad thing, I think, is how we might describe that. These are stats for Ireland, but basically it has a massive impact on our health system. And one of the things that we definitely see is the increasing level of harm. So if we were to look at something like liver disease, we find that people are presenting to hospital sicker than they ever were before. So they end up spending longer even in hospital than previous times. So it's very, very substantial, like the harm that is experienced. Certainly over the last 2 decades, we've seen things like alcohol-related liver disease nearly double during that time. And actually, if we were to measure over 3 decades ago, it has nearly trebled. So some of those other harms, and I'm always very conscious just when I'm talking here that, in our circle that there will well be people who are really impacted by what I'm talking about. But we know that, for example, alcohol has a massive impact on our mental health, and it is a factor in up to half of all suicides here in Ireland. Those sorts of harms in terms of health, crime costs. We see this in terms of domestic violence. We see it in sexual violence as well. And again, some absolutely horrifying statistics that would be around all of that. So a question that's often asked is, has it always been this way? And typically, as I say, I mentioned there that, when we say Ireland, very often people say, oh, well, yeah, because no one for drink or whatever. But actually, That pattern has changed at different times. So if we were to go back to the 1960s, and if we were to use that figure of, well, what are we drinking per head of population at that stage, we were drinking about half of what we're drinking at the moment. Um, and you can see that from the 60s onwards, there was a steady rise, and it reached a peak in the early 2000s. So it was actually up at 14, over 14 litres per capita. And from that, though, there has been a steady, I won't say there has been some decrease. So it is a bit better. I will say the government took a number of steps that kind of came into place there. And also there has been some changes in drinking patterns internationally as well, which would go along with that. But I think the question really is, why did it increase between the 1960s and the 2000s? What actually happened? What came about to bring that? And what changed was it became, I suppose, three things: price, marketing, and availability. It became much, much more available, more widely available. And this would be the case for the UK as well. So it used to be that you only really saw alcohol in a pub. But in fact, it then became an everyday item that was available for sale in shops, supermarkets, and more than 2/3 of all alcohol today is sold in what you might call off license. It became much, much cheaper. We can see that both in the actual price that's charged, but also Ireland as a nation became wealthier and therefore had more money, if you like, to spend on that. So its affordability became just simply much, much more affordability. And we also saw that in terms of relationships that were built up between the alcohol producers and the alcohol distributors, the supermarkets. So you'd see a lot of big deals, loss leaders in supermarkets with particular products. And then around all of that, there was this massive increase in marketing. And that's one of the things I'm just going to talk about a little bit more. And the marketing became ever more sophisticated. So we have tools like sports sponsorship. We have wraparound advertising. So you see on the internet, you see on billboards, you see on TV, you see in shops. All of this stuff all connects. And it's in any campaign that is put together has this wraparound thing. So that no matter where you are, you will see or you will experience some form of alcohol marketing. And it also became very targeted as well. So the sorts of ads that I would see for alcohol as a woman now in her 60s, had my birthday there a couple of months ago, will be quite different from what my daughter, who's 23 and living in Greece, she will see a different set of ads. But we will all see ads. And we will see ads that are designed very much to appeal to whatever is important to you. So using that, the three things that really brought about the big increase in alcohol consumption, the public health approach is that you therefore need controls on those three things. You need controls on pricing, on marketing, and on availability. And the World Health Organization is very clear that these are what they call the best buys, the best policy buys to bring about change in that overall alcohol consumption across the population. I will just say at this point that what I'm talking about mainly here is preventative action. You obviously also need a massive amount of treatment and help in hospitals for those who are, whether it's liver disease or whether it's somebody having alcohol use disorder, or whether it's a child who's grown up with an alcohol problem in the home, or whether it's cancer because of alcohol-related cancers or heart disease. You need all of those services to be in place as well. But they're mopping up the problem after it has occurred. So the public health approach is really to try and reduce the problem at source, to try and, I suppose, stem the flow, to turn off the tap, or at least to turn down the flow, so that if you're looking at it from a capacity issue in terms of services, that there might be a little bit less coming in. But also, if you think about it from an individual perspective, and anybody who's experienced an alcohol problem will say to you, do you know, I started drinking very early. I started to drink as a child. And we know that in itself is a massive risk factor for going on to have an alcohol problem at a later date. So reducing the level of children's exposure to alcohol marketing and things like pricing actually is really, really important in reducing that overall level of problem. So, back to that question of affordability, we know that alcohol in Ireland is very affordable. So, across OECD countries in 2019, we had the second most affordable alcohol across those countries. And this often surprises people when I say this because you say, "Oh my gosh, I've gone on my holidays in Spain, and I was able to get wine with my dinner, and it was half the price of what it would be at home." But what needs to be taken into account there is wages in Ireland are actually much higher than wages in Spain. So it's this affordability that really needs to be taken into account. Um, as we just mentioned there about the advertising, we know that advertising is incredibly important in a number of things. Firstly, your exposure to it simply makes it much, much more likely that you will drink, or to start to drink, or if you're already drinking, to drink more. Um, Looking specifically at children, the data here is that Diageo, who's the producer of brands like Guinness, Diageo is the number 4 broadcast advertiser to children. Now, the alcohol producers will all say, "Oh, we don't target children." I find it kind of incredible then that somehow children are actually seeing this level of alcohol advertising. A common thing that's often said by the alcohol industry is, "Oh, we just need a bit more education, and if people were educated, it'd all be okay." So, but to put that into context, if you were to kind of educate your way out of this, you would have to spend at least what the alcohol industry spends on alcohol advertising. And the spend in Ireland is annually about 115 million. Now, that's just for ads. That's just for plain ordinary ads that you see on TV or on poster boards. It doesn't include things like sports sponsorship. So that's another whole area in itself. The HSE, like the NHS, their alcohol program in the same year, we spent about 65,000 annually. So that's just to give you a sense of the scale of the difference and why it's not really possible to think in terms of educating your way out of this. Education is important. I'm definitely not saying that you don't have it. You need to have it. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. What's really needed is to massively reduce the amount of alcohol advertising, because that's the primary educator in this space. Sports sponsorship, as I just mentioned, is a particularly strong way of promoting a product. So the Guinness Six Nations is on at the moment, and you'll notice Guinness takes the precedent over the thing. You see this attachment between I suppose the healthiness of an activity like sport with a very unhealthy activity, alcohol, or a product, alcohol, and it's very deliberate. This is an industry that connects itself. This is how marketing works. It connects to whatever is important to you. So sport is particularly important one because children, firstly, watch a lot of it. In Ireland, the 10 top programs that are watched are big sporting occasions, so that by children. So that's an important thing. But there's also all the emotion that goes with sport. There's the excitement of it. There's the national identity that goes with it, or if it's a local team, your local identity with that. So it's extremely powerful indeed. And actually, Guinness make no bones about this. If you read their annual report, they pointed to their sponsorship of the Six Nations and the increase, the uplift in sales that they had from that, both within stadiums, but also in the wider public, and that's very well acknowledged. And you see this attachment, and say with multiple different sports, and alcohol sponsorship. Like I say, there's a campaign for everybody. It used to be that in Ireland, about 2/3 of all the alcohol was drunk by men, and 1/3 was drunk by women. And typically, where women appeared in alcohol ads, it was as an adjunct to an ad to get men to drink more. So kind of, basically crudely put, drink the product, get the girl would have been the message. About 20 odd, nearly maybe 3 decades ago now at this stage, there was an understanding that by the industry of actually there's a whole open market here for us. And so there was a pivot in the type of marketing that was there. And so you saw this absolutely enormous increase of marketing to women, which again latched on to lots of different issues. So you'd have had alcohol being put forward to women as an empowerment kind of a thing. You too have the right to drink like a man was essentially the message that was there. Strong, powerful women, would have been at that. Then for other demographics, particularly around wine, it would have been wine mom culture, if you like. So, had a hard day looking after the kids. Thank God it's Friday. It's 5 o'clock. Have a drink. That would have been a very, very strong thing that would have been there. But all of this marketing, not surprisingly, led to an increase in the amount of alcohol consumed by women. And so if we actually look at things like, the impact on women's health, so liver disease, in relation to women, alcohol liver disease discharges, as I say, more than doubled since 1995. And this would have been a group for whom it was usually seen as quite unusual to see women with liver disease. It was typically seen as an older man's illness, something that you perhaps got in your 50s. Increasingly now, liver specialists are talking about seeing young women in their early 20s, 30s with liver disease. Even less well known is actually the impact of alcohol on cancer. There's 7 different types of cancer that alcohol literally causes. One of those is breast cancer, and in fact, actually 1 in 8 breast cancers in Ireland are due to alcohol. And this is something that is very much not known or not really recognised in the general public, but is certainly well known within the medical community. So, with all of that in mind, there was the government acting on a report that came out in 2013 that looked at all of this evidence and put it together and said, right, what can we do about that? And they put together a package of measures, which is called the Public Health Alcohol Act. It was actually introduced into Parliament in 2015. It took 3 years to get through the legislative process. It has been described as the most contested piece of legislation in the history of the state, which is quite some boast. And certainly Alcohol Action Ireland would have been very involved in the advocacy work around this. But essentially, what it tried to do was to put some modest restrictions in the areas of price, marketing, and availability. So, for example, this the items in green over on the left-hand side are the ones that have been commenced. The ones in the yellow are just in the process of being commenced or hasn't actually started yet. But there is a prohibition on advertising certain places. So, for example, you can't advertise in public transport. You can't advertise within 200 metres of a school or a public playground or a public park, so youth-orientated facilities. There's a restriction on advertising during events. So, for example, during a sports match, you can't actually put an alcohol advertisement on the field of play. Now, the original thing was to have actually had a complete ban on alcohol sports marketing, but it got watered down to not advertising on the field of play. There's other restrictions about not advertising children's clothing. If you're advertising in cinemas, you can only do so if it's for an over 18 film. There's some restrictions on the sale of alcohol. So in a supermarket, for example, alcohol has to be confined to a specific area. That's this separation, structural separation that's there. And the idea there is to kind of point out that alcohol is no ordinary commodity. It is not the same as buying a pint of milk or orange juice. It is a different product. So that's why to put it to one side. And I would also say that obviously that's a lot of that is about children. But if you also think for anybody, perhaps in recovery, you should be able to go to the supermarket or shop and for your beans, your bread, whatever else you want, without being assailed by alcohol actually very much in your face. Another important element was this control on pricing, and what we have here is what's called minimum unit pricing. So it's so basically MUP puts a floor price beneath which you can't actually sell a product, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. The idea was to get around below cost selling, which had become a very common practice in Ireland. There's also some restrictions on how much you can sell at a particular time. So you can't do special offers, for example, on alcohol. You're not supposed to be able to use supermarket points to buy alcohol or get 2 for the price of 1, these sorts of deals. And there's also a thing where you're supposed to inform the HSE if you're applying for a license to sell alcohol. So these are all the things that have been commenced, and I have to say that every one of those, even getting through the legislation in the first place, to then actually getting them commenced, to getting the minister to sign an order to say, right, this is now is happening from, you know, a certain date. That has taken an enormous amount of advocacy on behalf of ourselves and others who would work in this space. So a big thing that goes along with this is the labelling of alcohol products, and that's due to come into effect in May 2026. I'm going to talk about that in a wee minute. There's this broadcast watershed, so we can't see alcohol ads before 9 p.m. That just started actually in January of this year. But there's also controls that are going to come in on the content of alcohol advertising. And the idea there is to strip out the myths that we see from alcohol and replace them with purely factual alcohol advertising, which is something that has been done in France, for example. But alongside that stripping out of the myths, they will put into it the same health warnings that will be on the product labeling that we're going to see from next year. So that hasn't been introduced yet, and there's also some other restrictions that are yet to come. But that'll maybe just give you a sense of some of the types of legislation that were put in place. So we didn't do this by ourselves. In order to actually really pull this together, it really needed a big coalition, and we would have been kind of, I suppose, prime movers in setting up this alliance of multiple different organisations who all, if you like, had skin in the game. And whether it was coming at it from a children's perspective, or whether it was coming at it from, you know, heart disease or cancer or treatment services or crime, sexual crime, domestic violence, there was multiple different groups who saw there's a reason to try and reduce the level of alcohol that's being consumed here in Ireland. So just come back to MEP, as I say, this is the thing that puts a base price. Now that's actually also in place in Scotland, and they were the first country to actually introduce that back in 2018. It is also in place in Canada and some former Soviet Union states, and some states in Canada, not across the whole of the country. It was in place in the Northern Territories in Australia, but literally in the last couple of weeks, it has been done away with there, really through pressure from lobbying, even though it had shown considerable reduction in domestic violence in those areas. We know we very much needed it. We used to do a price survey every year, and we would have found that, you know, a man could drink his low risk threshold for, you know, €8.49. Women could drink it for just over a fiver. What that now means with MEP in place is that if you were to drink 17 standard drinks in a week, which is the current limit for men, that price would now be 17, and for women it would be €11. And I will say there are low risk drinking guidelines are not really very low at all. They're certainly higher than the UK, and they're higher than those in other jurisdictions like Australia. But it'll give you a sense of really how cheap alcohol had got. And that's just a kind of a close-up of that affordability thing. If you're actually just looking at the blue line, you can see that really the price of alcohol today is the same as what it was 20 years ago. And that jump that came in 2022, that kind of bringing it back up again, that was when MEP came in. So MEP has been important, but it has only brought us back to where we were 20 years ago. In terms of actual price, in terms of affordability, it's actually 85% more affordable today than it was. So it's important, but it's not enough by any means at all. And one of the things that we are campaigning for right now is that the MEP level should be raised, because it was originally put in, the ideas behind it came from 2013. Obviously, inflation has eroded that particular value of €1 per standard drink, and it really needs to be increased. Those advertising restrictions that I mentioned on transport, close to parks, on the field of play, and the broadcast watershed, all of those have been introduced. However, what we have seen is a proliferation of zero alcohol product marketing in those very places. So I mentioned there just about no logo or no advertising on the field of play. So what we have instead is a 0.0. Barely visible, tagged onto that. And actually there's research from the University of Stirling that has found that since that legislation came in, that we're actually seeing alcohol brand references up to every 8 seconds, one every 8 seconds during some of those high profile rugby matches. So Sometimes you might think you're watching a rugby match. Actually, you're watching an awful lot of alcohol marketing is really what's there. And it's seamless as well. It's blended between Guinness 0.0 on the pitch, and then Guinness on the stands, and then moves back and forward, back and forward. What you're seeing is Guinness being advertised there. And it's interesting actually that if we were to look at, public transport, again, it's been banned there. There was a survey also done through the University of Stirling, and they found that 40% of adults said that they recalled seeing alcohol advertising on buses. Now, there's apparently no alcohol ads on buses, but 40% of the population think that there is, and there is, because what they're seeing is 0.0 ads, but what you really see is the brand that's there. These products make up about 2% of the market, but in those outdoor spaces where most of these restrictions are actually in place, they make up about 25% of the advertising spend there. So the industry know what they're doing. They may be saying that they're promoting a zero alcohol product, but they're actually promoting their brand. And indeed, it's very useful sometimes when you look at what the marketeers say about this. So the marketeers of Heineken Zero, in one of their reports, they very proudly point to the fact that not only did their campaign increase the amount of 0.0 products being sold, but it also increased the amount of Heineken's full strength being sold as well. So they know what they're doing here. In that structural separation in shops that I mentioned, so this is what it looks like. There, alcohol set off to one end. There's a barrier, not a very high barrier, 1.2 meters. That's supposedly the height of an average 8-year-old. It obviously doesn't really matter if a 10-year-old can look over it, but it was something. It is a modest measure. But what we have seen instead is that, again, you have this proliferation of 0.0 alcohol ads coming up all over the shop, at the entrance to the shops, in the shops themselves. And it really is diminishing the impact of the legislation there. But coming back to labelling, because this is a big story here in Ireland. From May 2026, we will have health information labelling on alcohol products. I'm just kind of coming up a little bit closer, to it there. So basically, it'll give you a bit of information about the amount of alcohol that's in the product, the calories that's there, a warning about not drinking in pregnancy, a warning that alcohol causes liver disease. And a thing that I think that has caused most controversy is a direct warning that there is a direct link between alcohol and fatal cancers, and as well as that, a link to a public health website. But what's interesting, and there's so much really about this. I mean, and we certainly had to do an awful lot of work, about it. But the basic reasons are that we have a big problem with alcohol. So just the pregnancy one, we have one of the highest levels of FASD in the world. We have very high levels of alcohol-related cancers. 1,000 of them are diagnosed every year, and this rising level of liver disease that has been mentioned. Our advocacy work here has been very much focused on, it is a consumer's right to know. We're not saying that a label and giving people information will necessarily be, the silver bullet, but we do know that when you do it as part of a wider package, you're more likely to see an impact. But even if you were just to separate out and only look at labelling, there's a very interesting piece of research that was done in Canada, who put cancer warning labels on alcohol products, quite prominent ones. And they did a comparison between regions that had them and regions that didn't have it. They found a 7% reduction in alcohol consumption over the period of a few weeks when people saw those cancer warnings. And the industry response was to get that experiment shut down after only running for a couple of months. So that'll just give you a sense of how little they don't want the public to know this information. And it's very similar to the campaigns that have been run around tobacco and warnings there. Because another thing that we find about warnings, and the research would show that while actually having the piece of information may or may not change a consumer's particular behavior, it also makes people more receptive to or understanding of the reasons to do things like price controls or advertising or marketing controls. So if you like, it not only educates you about the product, but it educates you as to why it is important to have those other controls in place. And that's been an important part of what we would be doing, is to be pointing that out. Massively complicated process, kind of getting through all of this at every stage. We've had to work on this because this is an international thing. We've had to bring this, or the government rather, has had to bring this to the EU because Ireland's part of the single market, and there's been various things there. We would have been involved in a big campaign of whipping up support, if you like, and we're so grateful to our many friends right around the world who have supported us on this, both within the EU process and also within the WTO, the World Trade Organization process. So basically what has happened within the EU, that they accept that Ireland's response to alcohol problems through labelling is a proportionate response to the situation that we has, and it's a recognition of members' competency, if you like, to adopt specific measures on the grounds of protection of public health. And that was made clear by the former Commissioner on Health and Food Safety. As I say, there's this process that we're going through with the WTO, so they also have to be informed about that. We know that there's an ongoing discussion going on at WTO, and again, we have been very active in this and trying to make sure that the public health voices has been heard. So 12 countries originally have been making comments and protesting about this. That's now down to 6. So, we appreciate, as I say, very, very much. And we have been very much helped in this regard by the World Health Organization and other organizations at producing a lot of reports and putting forward the evidence of why, in particular, cancer warnings are really needed on alcohol products. So as I say, some of the things that we have been doing, we commissioned polling data on this, and 73% would be in favour. And that didn't surprise us at all, because we would find that for most polling that we would do on anything, whether it's to do with availability, licensing hours, or advertising restrictions, you roughly get about 70% of the population are in favour of that. So very often the population is way ahead of politicians on these things. We've done an enormous amount of media activity. Typically in a year, we'd have between 500 and 600 media items in national news. We've worked with other organisations, as I say, through this alliance, and the Irish Cancer Society in particular has been very important in pushing it forward around labelling, and then, as I say, this international connections as well. And I think the thing that's really kind of heartening me is just the number of other countries who are now looking to do this. So Norway is pressing ahead with its proposals for labels on alcohol products, including cancer. Canada has made a strong recommendation of that. In January, the Surgeon General, who was the outgoing Surgeon General, he also put forward a strong recommendation for cancer warnings, and the WHO has been very clear on this as well. So what I would really love is for some other country to actually jump ahead of us, let it be Norway or whoever, and actually introduce them even before we do. It's a race. I'd be happy that somebody else would win us on this one. So the aim of all of that legislation was actually to reduce alcohol consumption by 20%. Now, it was originally thought of in 2013. We were supposed to achieve that by 2020. We haven't got there, but we're about halfway there at the moment. That figure, to reduce down to 9.1 litres per capita. That was an OECD average. But actually, if the whole of the country was drinking within the current lower risk drinking guidelines, we'd be drinking about 40% less. And you know what? That's actually the level at which Norway is drinking. And Norway would have a complete ban on alcohol advertising. It also has high prices for alcohol, and it has limited availability. So, for example, you can't just walk into a supermarket and buy alcohol. You have to go to specific shops, and those shops are actually a government-controlled monopoly on that, and they have, they have more limited opening hours and things like that. So what we have seen since the legislation came in, we've seen a 10% reduction, which is something. I will just say that in the UK in the same period, actually consumption went up by 3%. So it does to me indicate that if we had done nothing, this is probably where we would be. We would have increased our alcohol consumption, though it is still at a very high level. The MEP modelling suggests that we will see a continuing reduction in alcohol consumption. And I think very especially we'll see a reduction in the need for things like alcohol-related presentations to hospitals. So we will see that, and we'll see some reduction in crime that will come from it. But we'll only see this if we continue to keep the level pegged to inflation. And you will maybe would know that in Scotland, for example, which introduced this in 2018, they have just uprated their MEP rate as well, because they will also recognise that whatever benefits that we're accruing from it will diminish over time. We've seen a reduction in some hospital admissions. One hospital reported a near 7% drop before and after MEP. We don't know if that is absolutely related to MEP. There may be other factors because there's only one hospital, but it's a positive sign that's there. There are threats, though, to this progress. I've mentioned there about the 0.0 alcohol marketing. We also have concerns that's not been fully enforced. So, for example, we do see deals still going on in supermarkets, and we see things like bottomless brunches. That's kind of like pay a set price, drink all you like for 2 hours. And we would say these are definitely in violation of the law. So part of our work is to bring these to the attention of enforcement authorities in this area. We're also very concerned about another wing of government, the Department of Justice, who have been putting forward proposals to increase licensing hours. And actually all licensed premises could stay open an hour later, and there would be a facilitation staying open to 2:30, and indeed for nightclubs to stay open to 6 a.m. All of this, we would say, will undo that modest progress that we have seen to date. And indeed, we've been getting all of our old friends back together again, to call on the government not to go ahead with this, or at the very least to carry out a health impact assessment of these proposals, because we know, and the evidence is actually very clear on this, that if you increase those licensing hours, even a 1 hour increase is associated with a 17% increase in alcohol-related crime and up to 34% increase in alcohol-related hospital ED presentations. So let's not undo the good work. So yes, I think Ireland has led the way in some ways. There are some positives, but I do think we have an awful lot further to actually go. But I would be hopeful that some of what has been achieved in Ireland will actually be helpful for other countries and help move the way forward. And that's just about all I think that I want to say. I'm always very conscious, when I talk about alcohol, there could be people in the room who be really feeling it even more than that. So I've just put up a few links there that maybe, for some support and some help that people might be interested in having. But with that, I'm kind of at the end of what I wanted to say, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Sheila. Fascinating range of information that you've given us there. Let me just put us all on. There you go. I've stopped recording now. Yes, so much of what you were saying kind of mirrors the work that Quad has been doing in the rest of the UK in terms of our understanding of minimum unit pricing and the impact of advertising. But you contextualised it and really sort of talked about how that's framed within the whole of the sort of concerns about Irish society as well. And I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to go into that in so much detail. There's lots of questions I want to ask, but I don't want to dominate this discussion. I want to give friends an opportunity to come in now and sort of make their sort of observations or ask you questions. Feel free to do that, and I'll open up the meeting, if you like, for a broader discussion. Dan.
I just have an information question. There was one slide had on trade and off trade terms. Is that off license?
Yes, it is. So on trade would refer to having a license to sell alcohol on the premises. So that's things like pubs and restaurants. Off trade is having a license to sell alcohol, so it is taken off the premises. So in supermarkets and shops and things like that.
And I recall on license, the line went up, and off license, it.
Yes, so that's from a pricing perspective. So the price in pubs has kept in line with inflation, is really what you'd see there. It's still very affordable. Actually, it's about 17% more affordable today in pubs than it was 20 years ago. But it is certainly considerably more expensive to buy alcohol in a pub than it is to buy it in a supermarket.
And am I right in thinking, Sheila, that one of the ways that minimum unit pricing has had an impact, certainly in Scotland and in Wales, where it is also in place, is that supermarkets aren't now able to sell any individual product, even if they've got packs of 6 or cases of 12 bottles of wine. Each individual bottle or can has to meet that minimum unit price level.
Yes.
So
Yes,
that's
it
cut
is.
down that bulk buy ridiculously cheap alcohol that people have been able to.
That's exactly right, and I should have mentioned, of course, Wales in this regard. In fact, there was a good piece of research just published only a couple of weeks ago, actually looking at the impact of MEP in Wales. So yeah, before MEP came in, you would have seen these slabs of beer, which would have been a big thing. So very, sort of slab of about 24 cans of beer been sold at really, really cheap prices, like I'd say about €15, €16, per slab. And you just don't see those anymore. So that is definitely one thing. And again, that goes back to, if you think of the risk of buying large amounts of alcohol at any one time, literally alcohol poisoning is one of those risks that actually comes, from that. I give lots of statistics about, the level of alcohol consumption, but actually half of those who drink in Ireland drink in a way that is described as hazardous. In other words, you're likely to have a hazard, kind of come from that. So that's half of all drinkers would be in that category. So reducing that through MEP is definitely an important thing.
And can you help me? Because I always look across and think, well, in Scotland it's been 50p, it's going up to 65. Wales is advocating a similar rise, but in Ireland I can't do the translation across from euros.
Yeah.
What's the rate in Ireland?
Yeah, so 65. So our rate is €1 per standard drink. And there are there's these things, you both have a currency difference, but also our standard drink is 10 grams of alcohol, whereas the standard drink in the UK is 8 grams. But roughly the 65 pence in Scotland is equivalent to our €1 there. So they're now fairly equivalent in terms of that. But it's also important to remember that prices, in terms of cost of living and things like that, are different between different jurisdictions. So I would always come back to it's more important to look at affordability in any given jurisdiction rather than a particular price.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Robert. Good morning, Robert.
Good morning. It's nice to see friends gathered, actually. And thank you very much, Sheila. Yes, so I'm speaking as an ex-problem drinker, stopped nearly 18 years ago now. So what do we did? 2 or 3 things that I'll pick up that you said that I found really interesting. The amount of work you do with other countries using their examples, their results. And I think we've lost out as a country coming out of the European Union in many ways, but this is a really good example of where we don't have those influences of other countries around Europe. Dare I say it, I think it's part of the arrogance of the British English people, that we don't like to take take the thinking that any other country can have a better example than we do or can teach us anything. So that was one thing. The other thing is I hadn't really thought about the advertising as much as what you emphasised there, and particularly when it comes to no alcohol. And certainly with certain names, you don't need to talk about what they actually sell. Heineken, Guinness, all these things are automatically about alcohol and get people thinking about alcohol. Which led me on to thinking that hopefully, eventually, what we're aiming for is the same kind of thing as we've got with tobacco, where although I smoked heavily for 30, 40 years, I no longer can even start to remember the names of some of the tobacco companies anymore because they're just not out there and they're not even behind the counters when you go into certain shops that they used to be. So I know it's a hell of a long way to go, but I think that's what we have to aim for.
Oh, totally agree with that. And sometimes I give talks in schools, and I would ask people, children to name cigarette brands, and they're hard put to name ones unless they have a smoker in the household. But if you ask them to name alcohol brands, oh, they could give you 10, 15, 20 brands straight away. So they're extremely familiar with that, because it is ubiquitous. It's very much in your face. Another thing, just on the 000 thing, the industry use them in a number of different ways. So we would see it using them to get around marketing restrictions, but they also put them forward as a public health solution to an alcohol problem. They say, oh, look, we're doing all this wonderful work with 0.0. Look, we're advertising them. We're encouraging people to move, from full strength to that. And therefore, we don't need pesky restrictions like labeling on our alcohol products or restrictions on advertising. We would question a number of things, within that narrative that has been put forward. Firstly, 0.0 products are no ordinary product like the alcohol product themselves. Certainly for somebody in recovery, and people in recovery and treatment centres all say this, they're actually very dangerous products for somebody who's in recovery, because they so mimic the full strength product that they can tip you very, very easy into that. So that's the first thing. They are not suitable for children. Even the alcohol industry themselves say this, and yet that doesn't prevent them from advertising in supposedly child friendly environments. But more than anything, our concern is that they're being used to give a health halo to an industry about which there's nothing healthy about it. And we would certainly think that a good deal of the growth in these products is not coming from people transferring from drinking alcohol to that, but if they're on a night out, rather than drinking, a mineral Coke or whatever, that is a transfer from that market into this. So we would caution that we should be extremely careful in taking at face value what the alcohol industry is saying about this. And I would think that there's actually another way of looking at this is to say that, vaping products were put forward by the tobacco industry as a solution to, smoking cessation. And they were touted as being, oh, this will help everybody get off, and it'll be a kind of a useful smoking cessation technique. Again, I wouldn't be taking public health advice from the tobacco industry on this. Yes, it has certainly helped some people stop smoking, but it has, made a whole generation of children now vaping in a way that wasn't in the past, and it carries its own health risks as well. So I would always look for public health advice to public health experts like the World Health Organization, rather than the health harming industry itself.
Thank you, Sheila.
Yeah, thank you there, Sheila. Sorry, go on.
Before we come to you, Andy, just want to check in with Patsy, because you had your hand up for ages. Do you want to ask a question?
Well, I wanted to say thank you. It was extremely interesting. I really enjoyed it very much. But one of the things I wanted to say was how shocked I was, both in your presentation, but also in sort of life recently. Is I'm in recovery from alcohol addiction, and I one of the things that helped me greatly in early recovery was getting into a variety of sports. And more recently, I'm getting a bit old for all that now. So what I enjoy doing is watching women's football on television. And I was so shocked at the amount of advertising, some of which is alcohol advertising, but it kept on coming. It was like you'd see quite a small amount of the football, and then you'd have another advertisement of this. And I was thinking, well, I can't believe they're allowed to do this. I mean, I was just really shocked. I suppose it was new to me. I didn't realise that was allowed, and the impact, the visual impact, and it does affect how you feel, and consequently it's going to affect your thinking and what you will do. And yeah, I just wanted to say I've been very shocked, and I was very glad that you raised that so well in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And we oh my God, I'm so outraged really by the level of alcohol sports marketing that we see. A couple of things just to say about it. In Ireland, taking part in a team sport is actually a risk factor for drinking as a child, and that's because of this incredible link between alcohol and sports. So something that should be a healthy activity, something that you'd be wanting to encourage people to do, in fact becomes a risk factor. And you see that in all sorts of ways. You see it in children's drinking, you see it in athletes, elite athletes who are in team sports. Their alcohol problems that would arise there. And I suppose when I look at that vast amount of alcohol sports marketing that we see, and we see it in gambling actually as well, and a little bit of me goes, oh my God, we'll never get it changed. And then I go back and think, well, do you know what? Tobacco, we used to have the Benson Hedges snooker. We had players like in relation to tennis. So it can be changed, and at all times, like when it was being phased out, from when smoking was being phased, or when tobacco was being phased out from sports sponsorship, the cry from the industries, from the sporting bodies was, "Oh, we'll never survive." Well, you know what? They did, and they found other sports, and they found other sponsors, whatever came in. So you always have to take these cries of alarm with a great deal of skepticism, because things can change, but it really requires, I think, really seeing the advertisements. Sometimes actually there's so much of it that we don't even realize we're seeing it. We're absolutely submerged in it, and you don't see the wood for the trees, but of course you get the effect of it. Something that we've been looking at recently is actually the connection between big sporting events and domestic violence. And there is a link, a very strong link, in fact, between big sporting occasions, World Cup, football matches, things like that, and an increase in domestic violence. Very, very good research has been done on that actually in the UK. And we have a report ourselves coming out on this shortly. That's which is why it's in my head, So you have these connections between sport, between bank holidays, increased alcohol consumption, increased domestic violence that goes along with it. And these have been hidden things, because while people would have often talked about public disorder in relation to alcohol, we have been somewhat more coy in talking about domestic violence and alcohol, and the close relationship that there is to that with the promotion of alcohol. So I think we need to be very proactive and strong and about calling this out, and drawing attention to those links, which are there, and we're so grateful to the people who do the research that gives us this data that we can use in this regard.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you. Andy, you've been very patient. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. It was very interesting. I was just wondering what you can do about the lobbying and the influence of big business and the money that goes along with it. I mean, it's not just alcohol, it's the oil industry, anything environmental, pesticides. It's the companies with the money that seem to control the government. And I was just wondering, apart from sort of proportional representation and things like that, what you can actually do about the lobbying impact.
Well, one of the things that we are doing actually is linking with other organizations. And we talk a lot now what's called the commercial determinants of health, these health harming industries, whether it's unhealthy foods, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's alcohol, whether it's smoking. Actually, those four industries that I've just mentioned, they're responsible for a third of all deaths globally. It's actually quite extraordinary. And there's a growing movement around this. So one of the things, so we're part of an alliance actually here in Ireland that is pulling together some of those groups. And because I think our voice is stronger when we look at this, and you see the same techniques at play, the same types of lobbying, the same frameworks that are used, so all about personal responsibility rather than industry responsibilities, stuff like that. I would love to see a framework for government on how they interact with unhealthy industries. So things like, controls on the types of meetings that they have, with industry, the minutes being kept of these things. I mean, these are small things that I'm talking about, but actually can be quite powerful when put together. So I think sometimes these frameworks, are important things to be lobbying for, to be advocating for, apart from just things like a ban on alcohol sports sponsorship, which is a clear-cut thing, is something that we want. But actually, if you get these frameworks in operation, they really help you to advance your cause as well. So the big thing from a tobacco point of view, the thing that made the big difference there was the it was a treaty, that the international framework on tobacco was a WHO treaty, and it brought together various countries who signed it and who put together this framework of how we're actually going to manage individual governments. And it's incredibly important because so much of the regulation that's needed actually needs to be transnational. So internet advertising, for example, where I'm sitting here in Ireland, I'm looking at the ad on my iPhone or whatever here, but the ad is maybe been produced somewhere else and it's been controlled somewhere else. So you need to have these international frameworks to try and control, the regulations that are on that. And a start, I would say, is how that the government would at least put into place something like monitoring our interactions with unhealthy industries. And there are steps moving on that. So for example, in Ireland, the government has a thing called a strategic investment fund. So it's basically a big fund where we invest in money and stuff like that. They don't invest in tobacco industry and they don't invest in carbon fuels. I would like to see them not investing in the alcohol industry, because they do invest in the alcohol industry. And you have countries like Norway, for example, which doesn't invest in the alcohol industry, and its pension fund has been taking out its investments. So, things like that, sometimes, and people go, will that really make a difference? And I actually think, yeah, sometimes these things are really important, because they allow you to do other stuff as well. So a lot of my work is about talking to these other organizations, getting ideas, bringing us together, helping us to kind of, change the landscape, I think, in which we're actually operating.
It's so interesting hearing this, Sheila, and thinking, reading across, and Quad's concerned obviously with drugs and alcohol, but also with gambling. And the gambling industry is responding in exactly the ways that you're describing with alcohol and the other harmful industries. And the power of the gambling lobby and the alcohol lobby in the UK, in Westminster, is extraordinary. The influence that they have and the success that they've had in watering down or preventing legislative reform has been astonishing. And when you think back to what we call the big tobacco playbook, the strategies that the tobacco industry used, I think Ash was talking recently, the campaign for banning sort of what does ASH stand for? Somebody help me out here. Action on smoking harm. Was saying it took campaigners 40 years to stop the advertising of tobacco.
Yeah.
And the hope is that it's not going to take as long to see these other harmful industries' tactics, which they borrowed from the tobacco industry, to be stopped or at least sort of slowed down, because it's extraordinary the change in our lifetimes, all of us, from people smoking in offices and on aeroplanes and in cinemas and nobody thinking anything of it, to now, as said earlier, that you just don't see them. And thankfully, younger generations now struggle to name tobacco products.
Yeah. In Ireland, actually, just towards the end of 2024, there was legislation passed, which is the Gambling Regulation Act, which is about putting controls, public health controls on alcohol, or sorry, on gambling, and they include things like a reduction in the amount of advertising of products. But an interesting thing that they put in was a levy on the gambling industry to be directed towards treatment services. And we see this as a very powerful thing in relation to gambling, and we're using it as a model to say, basically, polluter pays kind of model. This product is causing this amount of harm, therefore a levy or taxes or whatever needs to be of an equivalent level within that.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually, again, a lot of what we try to do is to put things in these kind of macro leveled kind of the total amount of cost, because a favorite argument of the industry here is to say that they're incredibly important to the economy. We hear this all the time. Oh, we employ so many people, blah, 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 stuff like this. But actually, when you look at it carefully, so from an economic point of view, exports is really the only thing that counts in terms of importance to the economy. Because if people drank less within Ireland, they will spend more on some other product. They will buy more shoes, drink more coffee, whatever. That money will move to another part of the economy. So what actually counts from an economic point of view of prosperity is exports. Alcohol exports make up, but I'll just take a guess. I'll just ask, anybody like to take a guess of alcohol exports in Ireland as a percentage of our total exports?
5%?
It's actually 1%. Yeah, it's very small. It's really very small. And you never see that percentage in public. What you always see is millions of something or billions of something. And nobody holds millions or billions of anything. It's tiny. It's absolutely tiny. And yet they have this outsized role. So we see, for example, if ministers are out on a trade mission, they will always have Guinness by their side. They'll always be a part of this trade mission, even if the trade mission is actually more about beef products or something like that, agriculture or, trade of some other description. You will always see Guinness will have a stand somehow at this thing, that somehow they're a part of Ireland's export story. 1%, and yeah.
I was reading some media coverage this week. I think the Irish Times was one of them, talking about small alcohol retailers in Ireland, terrified that this labelling is going to come in and they're going to have to start sticking individual labels on all their different bottles, and how are they possibly going to survive this?
Yes.
Well, what's the AAI response to? You could say it's understandable, business people, and they're suddenly faced with what is a significant change, and some of them could go out of business as a result. What's your view on that?
So it's a very typical alcohol industry response. So by far the bulk of alcohol that's sold in Ireland is sold by 10 big producers, the global producers. They sell about 70% of all alcohol that's there. They don't tend to talk about their share of the market, but what they tend to talk about is we're on the side of the small trader, the small producer, so it's always like these poor people or whatever, and we're so sorry for them, stuff like that. Their concern, and it was being expressed from an importer's point of view, they were saying, other small producers in Italy, some craft producer of wine or stuff like that, they're not going to produce a bottle of wine with a specific label for Ireland. Well, a couple of things. Firstly, there are different trading conditions right around the world. So the industry, as indeed all industries have to produce specific labels for specific markets anyway. That is the case. So there's a pregnancy warning label for France, for example, but there isn't one for the UK. But sometimes you will see bottles that'll come out. So you do have different labels for different markets. The label that's been produced or that is required for Ireland, the onus is actually on the retailers to have the label on the product, not on the producers. And this is actually a very sensible thing, because if there is a small producer, let's say, who says, oh, well, I'm not going to produce a particular label for Ireland, you can still import that product and just stick a label on itself. So that gets around that. And then I would also say, well, isn't it amazing how small producers of things like orange juice and milk and homemade jams all have to produce labels which say what's in their product, and whatever there's actually EU legislation that says that all products that you buy must have a label with the ingredients and the calories that's in it. The one exception to that is alcohol. It's the only product available for sale across the EU which got a derogation from 2011 legislation, which required that. So, we were extremely annoyed at that article in the Irish Times because it was also accompanied by various myths, such as red wine is good for the heart, which is not the case at all. And we think it's very important that we point out that, you know, any paper such as the Irish Times or indeed a broadcaster like RTE is a vested interest here. They all take large amounts of income from alcohol advertisers. We have seen a pattern with with many media outlets in this of putting forward an industry friendly case, which on the face of it, when you would read it, first of all, it sounds very convincing. I see that, but when you deconstruct it and you kind of go, yeah, isn't it great to see that we're all so happy, we're so concerned about the small producers, when in fact the bulk is not, that actually the legislation does provide for this, but didn't actually ask us for our comment on this, you know, although they said people like AAI, you know, are in favor of it, they didn't come to us to ask for our opinion, where we would have, you know, pointed out, you know, some things. So it was a very, very biased piece of journalism from the so-called paper of record.
That's how it read. I was interested to see what your response was. It shows the power of the media, and also an understanding that, unfortunately, in this age where everyone is swamped with so much information that we have available, that people will tend to just skim headlines or perhaps read the first paragraph of something, but won't drill into the detail unless they've got a vested interest. Such as yourself. So thanks for that.
Yeah, so that's why, I mean, a huge amount of our job is constantly keeping this topic in the media. We put out our press releases. We're very happy when we see coverage of it in some kind of way. It's great when a body like the WHO puts out a new report or there's something in that. That gives us something that we can use as a handle to get it back in a public health perspective, back in the media again. But we know what we're up against. We can see it. Oh my God. Like, you know, every morning, this will tell you what I do. 7 o'clock every morning, I Google alcohol, the word, like what has happened in the news in the last 24 hours. And there's an astonishing amount of coverage of alcohol stuff that's there that is very industry friendly, you know, is really what we would see on it.
I'd say that's not a particularly great start to the day.
There's sometimes you'd be so annoyed, like, you know, you see something, you go, oh my gosh, this is just awful, like, you know. But there you go. You could also imagine then the kind of alcohol, the amount of alcohol advertising that I see as a result of that. In fact, we had a new guy started with us there a few months ago. Lovely fella, really, really nice. And he was saying he doesn't drink an awful lot, and he's very committed to this whole area. He says, I don't know what it is, but ever since I've joined this, I feel myself wanting to drink more. And I'm kind of going, that's because you're seeing now enough, even more alcohol advertising. It's now been driven to you, it's been there, it's there. Because even a story that is illustrating, sometimes even a public health story about alcohol, is always accompanied by a very lovely picture of alcohol. It'll show you a beer with, you know, like you know, condensation, you know, like, or kind of thing. You'll have a lovely picture of a red wine glass and stuff like this. It's always accompanied by these ads, which are designed to make you want to drink, even when they're there to illustrate a public health thing. It drives us bonkers. We actually have a media guide for journalists. We put it on all our press releases, but I don't think anybody reads it. But we do our best, you know, to try and say things like this, you know. And at least on public health sites and people that we talk to, we do mention this, because sometimes, you know, a graphic designer, even, you know, they have the urge to make a nice picture, and we kind of go, no, we don't need a nice picture here. We need the facts, nothing else.
Images speak louder than words, as we know. And it was that slide that you had with the bus with the advert for a zero beer, and it's a lovely frothy cold glass of beer, and from across the road, or, you know, when you're standing at the bus stop, you wouldn't differentiate. You're subconsciously registering that as a potentially lovely glass of proper beer.
Absolutely. That's what you see, you know. And,
Yeah.
we're demented by it.
Any other observations that people want to make, or questions for Sheila while she's with us?
I just wondered whether the labeling